I'd like to welcome everyone to the JCPA Delegates Assembly on Policing and Public Safety. I'd like to remind everyone to mute your audio and block your video during the presentations. My name is Michael Fromm. I'm chair of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. It's great to have almost 190 people registered today and more than 80 JCRCs and national agencies represented on today's Zoom call. The Delegates Assembly is the highest deliberative public policy body in the community relations field and brings a network of JCRCs and national agencies together to grapple with the pressing issues of the day and to educate, advocate, and mobilize. The grievous killing of George Floyd and the national response has sparked the most significant conversation around systemic racism in America since the 1960s. And it came during the COVID-19 pandemic that highlighted racial and economic disparities that exist in our country today. That these issues have been raised to such a level is a clear call to action for our network. JCPA and the Community Relations Network must be a leading voice in the Jewish community on ending racism, hate, and bigotry. We have a strong history on civil rights and have spent the past 4 years educating and advocating on criminal justice reform. We are ready to engage in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement to work for revisioning public safety in our communities and our nation. I want to thank everyone for making this session a priority today. And I want to thank our criminal justice co-chairs, Faye Taxman and Bruce Turnbull, for working with Melanie Roth-Gorelick and the JCPA staff to create an important program with tremendous speakers who will help us take a deep dive into these important concerns. Now I'd like to turn the program over to David Bohm, JCPA's Policy Advisory Chair. David?
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. I'm glad you've taken the time to attend this very important Delegate Assembly meeting. Particularly since the killing of George Floyd, we've been asked to take positions and engage in more substantive level on policing and public safety. In many ways, this is very different from the criminal justice reform work in which JCPA and many of our JCRCs have been engaging over the last several years. JCPA has been very active on the federal level, working with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and in our national coalitions on this topic. We helped to develop and signed on to an 8-point platform of priorities that should be included in any federal legislative package. We submitted written testimony in support of this platform to several congressional hearings. We also passed a JCPA resolution on restorative justice in February, although as I mentioned, it does not address many areas or many of the issues which deal with systemic racism in policing that are now being raised in the public square. While JCPA is advocating on the federal level for changes, most policing takes place at the state and local level. So the positive change can only come about by involvement with our state and local governments and police forces. The current public discourse and advocacy is being framed not only about making changes to the way police interact with the public, particularly minority communities, but also around a fundamental re-examination of what we need to do to enhance and deliver public safety within our communities to everyone, regardless of color, creed, gender, or religion. We in the Jewish community, who have relied on police to protect our institutions, particularly since 9/11, will have to balance such protection against what is necessary to dismantle institutional racism within policing and to ensure that the public safety needs of all communities, particularly communities of color, are met in a fair and equitable manner. For many of us in the community relations field, this is a new issue, particularly at the local level. For many of us, it's been hard to sift through new terms and voluminous media reports to understand the policy issues and the proposals that are being put forward by advocates in this area. JCPA has organized this program to help you understand and make the case for engagement on these issues and provide you with the knowledge and a roadmap you need to have to be at the table where decisions are made in your state and local communities. We've put together 4 panels that will make up the assembly. The agenda and the bios have been sent to you separately in an email. The sessions include ending systemic racism in America, policing and where do we go from here, and redefining public safety. What do we need to succeed? At 2 p.m., you'll be placed in a breakout group where you'll have time to reflect on what you have learned in small groups. During the sessions, we will turn off your videos and microphones, and we encourage you to watch the program in speaker's view. You can feel free to chat and to share questions in the chat box. The questions will be grouped and shared with the moderators, who will ask as many of the questions as they have time to the participants in the panels. So let's begin the program. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Scott Roberts. Scott is the Senior Director of Criminal Justice Campaigns for Color of Change. He leads digital campaigners, researchers, and field organizers in rallying support to end mass incarceration, fight the way our society criminalizes Black people, and secure more humane treatment for all those in contact with the justice system. Scott?
Thank you, David and Michael. I also want to just give a special thank you to Melanie for inviting me to participate in this conversation and this program, and for getting me on the phone, prepping me, making sure that I have myself together, and can hopefully do the best job possible of kicking us off here in this conversation. I want to just thank everyone who has joined this conversation. I think we're obviously in a very interesting time where we are having the really critical conversations that are long overdue here in the United States. And there is an opportunity, I think, for real change. In my experience, that is an opportunity that can be fleeting. So it is really critical that we have leaders from all types of backgrounds, from all over the country, who are willing to remain committed to this fight for the long term. And I just am so excited to see that so many people have joined this conversation today to try and wrestle with these issues. So in talking to Melanie and preparing for today, I think what I'm going to do is just take a little bit of time trying to ground us in the moment that we're currently in around these issues of policing and systemic racism. And if we have time, talk a little bit about, I think, what has been probably the call for change that has drawn maybe the most attention and created maybe a bit of confusion, which is this call to defund the police, and try to connect that to where we are in terms of systemic racism right now as a country, and our how we got to call for a solution like defund the police. Let me just start by saying, weeks ago when I first saw the video of George Floyd's death, for me it was a really devastating moment, to be honest. Having done this work around trying to deal with systemic racism and working towards racial justice over the last several years, it is disappointing every time we see one of these instances. I was very involved in the organizing and mobilizing of people in the wake of the killing of Trayvon Martin, of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Freddie Gray in Baltimore. It's a long list, unfortunately, of places that over the last 6-7 years I've traveled to try to work with local organizers on the ground to both try to get justice for individuals who have been impacted by police violence, but and also to try and bring some systemic change to communities where those instances of violence are symptoms of larger issues when it comes to the criminal justice system. For a little context, I, as was said earlier, I'm the Senior Director of Criminal Justice Campaigns at Color of Change. Prior to that, I was a Senior Campaign Manager at Advancement Project, which is also an organization that works to address racial justice around the country. There I worked with parents and student organizers around what we call the School to Prison Pipeline, which is a set of systems and practices that push Black and Brown students out of schools and into contact with the criminal justice system. Currently, as the Director of Criminal Justice Campaigns at Color of Change, I'm working on a wide range of criminal justice issues, as David said in the bio. But our approach at Color of Change is to make the world less hostile for Black people by shifting the incentive structures of decision makers, right? So how do we move people who have the power to make decisions that will make that impacts Black communities? How do we change their political calculus, their business calculus when it comes to corporate targets around whether or not they should care, frankly, about Black folks? We were founded in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And I'll come back to that in a second when we talk about systemic racism. But I think, you know, as I was saying in return of my response to George Floyd, it was just devastating to be doing this work for so many years and see this kind of cycle happen over and over again. And I remember seeing the video and knowing that we needed to respond, and waking up the next morning to that familiar scene of people rising up in cities around the country, protests taking to the streets. Some of the protests obviously being also, you know, featuring property destruction, things of that nature. You know, and knowing that oftentimes what happens is when we hit that point in an uprising, that's when things start to turn and people start to say, well, this is not an appropriate way to protest. So I started to think that here we are going through this cycle. But what happened over the next few days really blew my mind as someone who's been close to this work for a long time. And that is seeing people taking to the streets all over the country. One, we saw, I think, a larger scale of protests, and we saw a diversity in those protests. Many white people showing up in ways that had not happened 5 or 6 years ago in places like Baltimore and Ferguson. Protests happening in places that are small and hardly have any Black people, where you never would have expected to see a Black Lives Matter protest. And we're seeing, leaders at all levels of our society, in government, in corporate America, religious leaders, et cetera, taking a bolder stand on the need to value Black lives and defend Black lives than ever before. We're seeing public polling data that's showing that the idea of Black Lives Matter, the movement, is as popular as it's ever been. The New York Times wrote an article saying this may be the largest social movement in the history of the United States. And that is incredibly inspiring. And at Color of Change, we often talk about the need to shift from presence to power. As Black people in America, we have a lot of presence. We tend to be really present in the entertainment industry. Within politics, we are often, Black faces are often lifted up, and then our presence is amplified to show diversity, whether in either party. And in instances and in moments like this, we have a lot of presence in the streets. We're trending on social media, but how do we take that momentum and turn it into real change? And so I think that's where we have to really wrestle with this issue of systemic racism, right? And so many people, I think, in America think of racism solely as interpersonal race, and what we call interpersonal racism, just interactions between individual people. And whereas systemic racism is built into and baked into the practices, into the culture, into policy in the United States, and they often interact and intertwine in ways that are frankly frustrating. But for instance, there's this phenomenon now, right, of calling out folks who have been doing this practice of trying to weaponize the police in personal interactions with Black people. So I think the most recent story that really caught national attention was this instance where this Black bird watcher in New York had the police called on him by a white woman, and she was very clear. I'm calling the police and I'm telling them that a Black man is harassing me because he asked her to leash her dog. And it's a clear instance where a moment of kind of an interpersonal reaction where the prejudice of this woman contributed to the kind of animosity in the reaction, turned into her then weaponizing the systemic racism built into our criminal justice system, saying that I'm going to call the police and tell them that a Black man is harassing me, says that she understands that there is something baked into our system that says, if you tell the police that it's a Black person, they're more likely to react in a certain way, right? To restrict that person's freedom, to even inflict some kind of violence on that person. And just a couple of examples that I would share in terms of how we can understand systemic racism in a country right now. One is, I'll just take a little more time to say a little bit more about myself. I am from a small town in Virginia, Southern Virginia, called Emporia, Virginia, and that is 60 miles south of Richmond. If you're paying attention to Richmond, Virginia right now, you know that there's a big fight right now over Monument Avenue, which is like a line of Confederate statues. Richmond having been the capital of the Confederacy for most of the existence of the Confederacy, there's a whole avenue that's just statue after statue of Confederate soldiers, and they've been fighting about it at least since I was a kid, which was a long time ago in the 80s and 90s. And during that period when I was growing up in Emporia, we saw systemic racism really, I think, saw it firsthand, and it showed up in a lot of ways. And I'll just like quickly go through some examples that I saw. So in my hometown, which is about 10,000 people, actually majority Black, about 65% Black, but there was a white power structure that was determined to use systemic racism to prevent Black control or increase political power in the town, and to hold on to that for white folks. So one of the most obvious ways that it was done was through gerrymandering. So systemic racism shows up in our political process when we suppress votes through things like voter ID, but also just through gerrymandering. They were able to, even in a majority Black town, draw city council districts in a way that concentrated Black people in three of the 7 council districts, meaning that there would still be a white majority on the council. We had housing segregation. My hometown was literally one of those places where you could live on the quote unquote right or wrong side of the tracks. In our case, the Black or white side of the tracks. And then education. I saw that as a young person, there was an incredible amount of tracking in our system. So our schools were about 70% Black. My mother insisted that I take the gifted test, which was our kind of program. And that program was traditionally about 20% Black. So we saw kind of the ways that the educational system would kind of steer students of certain backgrounds into certain programs. One of the big things that happened as I was a kid growing up in the early 90s was that we became a prison town. So we had manufacturing, we had meat processing plants, we had a lumber yard, a number of things of that nature. As manufacturing started to leave in the late 80s, we got prisons instead. I remember the 4th grade taking a tour of the new prison. It was very exciting. There were going to be a lot of jobs coming. And I think it just, and now my hometown is officially a prison town. There are 4 prisons, public prisons, private prisons, men's prisons, women's prisons, in about a 50-mile radius around the county. And this has become our economy. And I think this is what's scary about where we are as a nation when it comes to our criminal justice system. Our criminal justice system has come in and both served as a way for many people to make money in the United States, but also as it's grown and that economic incentive has grown, it has swallowed up communities, families, individuals in a way that is not healthy. And it's become a tool for us to solve every issue in our country. And I guess the other just example that I would just quickly go to is something that I think Michael and David both alluded to is the coronavirus. So COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on Black communities in particular, not because Black people are more biologically or genetically set up to contract the coronavirus, but because of the systemic racism baked into our system. So health-wise, Black folks, because of economic disparities, but also because of segregation and access to healthcare, there are higher levels of pre-existing conditions that make you vulnerable to the coronavirus in Black communities. Economically, in addition to the economic factors that make that put us more at risk from a health standpoint, many Black folks are working in essential jobs, right? So there's a class and race mixture that leaves a lot of Black folks working in minimum wage jobs and service jobs and the types of jobs that you can't work from home. And there was a study that showed the majority of white workers were able to work from home during the social distancing period, where the majority of Black workers were not able to. And then finally, our criminal justice system, right? Because our criminal justice system is so vast, so large, and because prisons and jails are breeding grounds for the spread of a virus like the coronavirus, like COVID-19, they are hotbeds for the spread of this disease, and they're disproportionately, that's disproportionately impacting not only Black people who are going inside of, who are being held in prisons and jails, but then the communities that they impact when they are released. And so I think one of the takeaways for us is that this kind of fix all that approach that we've taken to criminal justice, where we have continually increased spending on prisons, jails, and police over time, has put us in a position where we've become overly reliant on those things as solutions.
Scott, could we ask you to
wrap up? I got to wrap up. I'm sorry. Yeah. We'll wrap up really quickly here. And so there's, as communities have been struggling, especially Black communities, there's been a constant approach that says the fix to this is always more policing, more enforcement, more punishment. And our movement right now is saying that's enough of that. We need to shift our priorities, think about what the solutions are beyond policing, beyond prisons, beyond jails. And I know you all are going to deal with these kind of like alternative approaches in the second panel. I just want to say that this call to defund really is both a practical call to re-examine things like city budgets and things of that nature, but also it is this call to reimagine what public safety looks like and how we deal with communities that have been historically oppressed, communities and individuals that are in crisis. What are the things that we would want, what are the solutions? So the last thing I would just leave people to think about, especially speaking to an audience that is, mostly not Black folks, and I'm assuming doesn't live in Black communities. When we think about safety and what makes our communities safe, what are they? What are those things that we're looking towards? And I think for most people, it's not having a police officer on every block and massive police forces. It's healthcare, mental health, jobs, good schools. And I would just hope that we can, as we continue this fight to end structural racism in this country, that folks can join with us in demanding that type of investment in Black communities going forward. In order to reverse 400 years of systemic racism, we're going to have to make some big, bold changes. And this demand to defund police is a bold demand, but I think that's been the history of the Black struggle in the United States, a lot of bold demands, and been really grateful that Jewish communities have been with us through a lot of that. And just thank you all again for having the opportunity to speak to you all. Hope this was helpful. And thanks again.